My name is Matt Griffith, and I'm an architect at In Situ Studio, and we're super glad you're here tonight. It's really weird to be wearing these again, especially weird that I'm hanging it off my ear. I don't know why I'm doing that. Many of you have been to one or more of these events already. This is our 7th event over the last 10 days. We've had an amazing series of lectures and panel discussions, lots of folks coming, active discussion about the future of the built environment in our city, and it's been really wonderful. So thanks for coming again tonight. I did want to give those of you who haven't been here before just a little background about what's going on here. This lecture series, this being the final night of it, is part of the Real Matter workshop, which is something that our office started planning 8 months ago as an opportunity for young designers from across the Southeast to come to our city, learn about it, discover things that could be better about the city, and propose and design projects that kind of address those issues. We opened it up to students throughout the Southeast and young professionals, got a number of applications. It was a selective application and admittance process, and ended up with 17 participants here who've been here for the last week and a half and will be here through Friday, learning about Raleigh and working on projects that deal with issues our city faces. I did want to recognize them. They hate it when I do this, but most of them are here on the front row, so if y'all could stand up real quick. That's the 2021 Real Matter cohort, as we've been calling them. They probably have other names for themselves. But I want to thank you guys first, because it was an act of faith to apply, not knowing whether or not COVID would have relinquished its grip by the time we wanted to do this thing, and just following through and coming for many of you to a city that you aren't familiar with and bringing so much energy to the table. I also want to thank some really important folks who helped make this possible. We have 19 sponsors who sponsored the workshop and this lecture series. Many of them, some of them gave in-kind donations, like Transfer Food Hall, who gave us a really great deal on the co-working space for the studio and this space for all of the events. Guest House Raleigh gave us a great rate for speakers. That's where you guys are staying. And the Longleaf gave a great rate to students who are here from out of town. We also have financial sponsors. And one thing I've said every night, and it really is probably one of the most significant things about the workshop, is that many of the sponsors are other architecture firms, some of whom we compete with every day for work. For us, that's one of the most amazing things about practicing here. Not only do we have an amazing school, not only do we have an amazing design community with way more talented firms than a city this size should have, but we all support each other. So many of the names on that list are firms that we interview against probably once a week, once every 2 weeks. So thank you for sponsoring this. You made it possible. I think that's all I'm going to say. The one thing I wanted to let everybody know is that we will be displaying the student work at the end of this. The final review is tomorrow morning. Participants then have a little over 24 hours to wrap up their work and make it as great as it can be. Friday is First Friday. I don't know how that's going to go with the Delta variant, but we are going to have work on display in the space here until about 8 o'clock before we head off and have a going away party for everybody. But we will also be getting the work up online. All the lectures have been recorded. They'll be online, so you can kind of see the whole thing once it's over with. And there's a chance, we just renovated the front of our office to be kind of a gallery space. I think we'll probably display the work up there at some point and have an event too. So we'll just stay in touch with everybody after this is over. We're really excited y'all are here, Stella Betts and David Leven. For our firm, you guys are, you're just like hero firm in terms of the work you're doing. We are always cribbing on it and using it for precedent, and just really interested in the work you've been doing. And it's amazing that you've been working at so many different scales, which I think is pretty unique about your office. So excited to hear the talk tonight. I'm not going to say anything else about that. I'm going to turn it over now to David Hill, who's the director of the school, the architecture school. The architecture school sponsored this lecture specifically. That's not why David gets to go up here and talk. He didn't have to. It's not a pay-to-play sort of scheme. But David's going to introduce Stella and David, and then we'll get underway. So thanks so much for coming.
All right, thank you, Matt. I really do appreciate you allowing me to introduce David and Stella tonight. And maybe it is a pay-to-play. We're happy to sponsor this as the School of Architecture, and happy to see so many students and faculty from the school as well. Before I introduce David and Stella, I would like to say a couple of things. One is that, a few months ago, Matt called me or emailed me. I don't recall at this point. But maybe he Zoomed with me. That was probably it a few months ago. And he said, well, we've got this idea. We're going to do this summer workshop with students. We're going to have a lecture series. We're going to have a gallery exhibition. We're going to do all this stuff. And I thought, that's a great idea. And I thought, no, that's stupid. That's the craziest idea I've ever heard. How are you going to do that? And I, of course, didn't say that to Matt. I was very supportive, I think. This is a great idea, sure. But, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, that really is insane. We do lecture series every year at school, and they're really difficult. They're hard to put on. And by the way, you want to have your competitors help to sponsor this thing, too? During COVID, you're really taking a big risk here. And I realized it would do no good to tell Matt that, because he's crazy and he knows he's crazy. And so for me to just say that would have, deaf ears, would have fallen on deaf ears. But I do want to say that it is truly miraculous that he's been able to pull this off with In Situ. And I think that was the other thing, the other realization, that it's not just Matt, right? It's a whole office of people who really care deeply about architecture and who are going to commit to something like this and put it on. And you guys have just done a wonderful job. So, Brittany, Megan, Meredith, who else we got? Zach, of course, right? Sarah, right? And even Vincent in the Chicago office, right? So, I mentioned Megan. She's doing double time. She's helping to organize and she's participating in the workshop. And so I just want to thank you, because this is a real gift to the architecture community here in Raleigh and in the Triangle, and I think to the greater Raleigh community, not just architects. We've seen a lot of people in the seats over the past week and a half who maybe hadn't really thought about how architecture can change their lives and how architecture can have an effect, a positive effect on the city. And so I think that's a real gift, and I appreciate everything that In Situ did to put this together. I think it's also worth recognizing the students, and I know you made them stand up. I won't make you stand up. But here's the thing, from a director of a school of architecture, to know that 17, 20 students would take the second half of their summer and dedicate it to an architecture workshop where they're not getting credit for anything. This doesn't count back at your home schools, right? It does go in your portfolios, I hope. But to know that you care that much about architecture is really heartwarming. And I want you to know that when you do show up in an office with this in your portfolio, the people who are interviewing you are going to look at that and say, wow, you really do care. You're passionate about what you do, and we want to hire you. I know it goes beyond that. It's not just about getting hired. It's about learning and enriching your education. But really, congratulations to you. I've walked through and I've seen the work, and you guys have done some wonderful things in just a short period of time. Good luck tonight finishing it, though, okay? Yeah. Right? One last thing I would like to say, and this is, as the slides are rolling through here, this has been a wonderful lecture series. We've had a concurrent lecture series going on at the school that is to honor the architect Phil Freelon, who passed away, I think about a year and a half ago. And so we put on a series where we're featuring lecturers who have been inspired, possibly worked for or with Phil along the way. And so tomorrow night, timing is good, right? Tomorrow night, Andre Johnson and Leroy Aliasman will be speaking, and this is on Zoom. This is not a gathering like this, unfortunately. But I'd like to invite you all to attend that. Andre's firm is one of the sponsors of this whole series. And so please, take some time. It's just about an hour and 15 minutes while you eat your dinner, maybe, and come out and to listen to their work. Andre's office was just awarded a Design Vanguard Award, which I think you guys were too, just a few years ago, so they share that in common. But we'd love to have you there. So now, moving ahead, I want to introduce Levenbetts. Levenbetts is an award-winning New York City-based architecture practice founded by David Leven and Stella Betts in 1997. The practice focuses on design at a range of scales, including urban design, public architecture, houses and housing, commercial workspaces, exhibitions, and furniture. Levenbetts' work has been recognized nationally and internationally through awards, exhibitions, and publications. The office has won 11 New York City AIA Design Awards and is currently working on its 5th New York City Public Library, which I hope we'll see some of those. They're incredible. Also working on a 300,000 square foot life sciences laboratory building, a museum exhibition for a house prototype, and a series of pavilions and residential projects. Levenbetts has been published widely, most notably in a monograph on the first 10 years of the firm's practice called Pattern Recognition, and is currently working on a publication that locates 13 of the firm's residential projects within the current discourse in architecture of houses. David and Stella have taught at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. David is an associate professor at Parsons School of Design and has taught previously at Cornell, City College, and Syracuse University. David received a Bachelor of Arts from Colgate University and a Master of Architecture from Yale University. David also studied at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York City. Stella currently teaches at Yale and Cornell. She has taught previously at Columbia, Cooper Union, and Syracuse. Stella received a Bachelor of Arts from Connecticut College and a Master of Architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. David serves on the board of directors of the New York AIA chapter, and Stella serves on the board of directors of the New York Architectural League. We're delighted to have you both here tonight. Thank you for coming down today. I'll turn the stage over to you. Welcome.
You want this one? Thank you for the introduction. We're going to take these off. We're not actually here robbing banks. We really wanted to thank everybody for coming out. We all just can't believe that we're doing this again. But so it's really an honor, and we're just so grateful that everybody came out tonight to talk with us.
Are we all set? Ish?
We are.
And thank
Yeah.
you also for the invitation, and thank you, Matt and Zach and David, for that really generous introduction. And we're thrilled to be here and so impressed by this program that was started this summer. And so we're very excited to be a part of the lecture series.
So we're so impressed by this idea of real matter. And it's actually, we're becoming more and more impressed as we spend time here, just even in the few hours we've been in town. But we really wanted to respond to this idea of the real. And, you know, I think we've always been committed in our practice to real process and real practice, no matter what we're doing. If it's speculative work, if it's pragmatic work, we're, you know, sure. If it's speculative work, if it's pragmatic work, the way we go about things, we think of them as extremely real. The architecture has massively real implications for the way that we exist as human beings, live, learn, et cetera. So we're going to talk about our work in relation to the prompt of real matter in this lecture series. Thank you. This is a really well-placed microphone now.
Did you hear anything else we said
Yeah.
before? Oh, okay.
Something about real,
Hi,
whatever.
thank you.
Yeah. And one of the prompts that we're so interested in is this idea of the urban challenge of architecture. And we're going to talk a lot in the talk tonight about our work relative to the urban challenges that our work engages, basically. We're going to talk then deeply about process, which relates to everything that we do that may or may not necessarily be urban, but we think that everything that we do, even in rural areas, is urban. When we human beings touch the earth, we're urbanizing in a sense. So this is just sort of a smattering, a grid of projects. Our practice takes on it. We're really committed to civic architecture, mostly in the form of public libraries right now that David spoke about. And we also work at the scale of the single-family home, exhibitions, furniture design. Right in the middle is this 300,000 square foot life sciences building that is nearing completion in Harlem right now, which is, you were talking about scale before.
It's definitely the biggest project we have
as scale
have
goes,
done.
this is
Yeah,
top dog.
for us.
There's some other smaller ones here. And so that gives you just a sense of the scope of our practice.
And we're located, obviously, in New York City, right in Chelsea, right off the High Line. And we're located, actually, in the gallery district. We both came from non-architecture backgrounds. We originally did fine arts as undergraduates. So we also really run the office very much like a studio. And there's a lot of intensive model making. So I think a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight as well is process. Of really kind of taking an idea from concept and sharing with you some of our kind of model making process and things that really inform the design. And so this idea of scale is really interesting because you can talk about scale of the actual projects themselves, but we're going to show you one project in particular that also deals with just the scale that we work at as architects, right? We're always making scale models, so everything is at one scale, and then we, or multiple scales, but it's not at real scale, so we're going to be talking about that as well. So we're going to start with this idea of spaces of learning. So we're going to show you a series of projects based on that. And we're going to start with the free library, which is, as David said, a really important part of our practice in terms of the idea of the role of the library as a civic building in the city. And speaking of free libraries, I mean, the image on the left is Henri Labrousse, the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève from 1850. And although there are other libraries that were considered free libraries, this is one of the first ones that are really kind of confirmed as a free library, and part of it has to do with the structure was cast iron, so it was less susceptible to fire, moving away from wood framing in libraries, and that allowed them to have gas lighting, which meant that the library could stay open beyond daylighting hours, so it wasn't just lit by the day, which meant that university students and other members of the public could actually attend the library. So in the evening. And then, of course, so that was a really catalytic project in many ways. And then another one, of course, much later is OMA Seattle Public Library that really transformed the program of the library beyond a container of books as really a community center, incorporated other elements of program. And then, of course, for us, very important in New York City, but across the country, Andrew Carnegie's campaign for public libraries, but we're going to talk specifically about branch libraries because a lot of what was so important about that campaign of Carnegie for all these different free libraries across the country and actually in Europe and other areas was a lot of these as branch libraries that were located in neighborhoods that didn't necessarily have access to the books in the same way. So like the central libraries, of course, are important, but they're in major metropolis locations, whereas like the idea of the branch library is really important. So we're going to talk about a few of our New York City branch libraries that we've been fortunate to be able to work on. So 4 of them are located in Brooklyn, in Red Hook Borough Park, Flatbush, and Brooklyn Heights, and then one of them in Queens. So these are the 5 libraries, and we have found that almost all of these libraries have about an 8,000 square foot footprint. Some of them have more than 1 story, although most of them, the small libraries that we've worked on 1 story, and a couple of them have more, but they're all about 8,000 square feet. But they all have their own character, and I think that's really important. Like each neighborhood has its own identity and its own character. So these are the sort of 5 libraries in their different states of design. And we're going to talk about 3 of them here this evening.
So the urban challenge.
Do you
we're
need
going
to-
we're going to keep touching back to this idea of the challenge. In the Brooklyn Heights Library was that the library was an interim library, so it was not supposed to be permanent. It was temporary, and the challenge was multi-layered. The library had to go into a parish hall of a church, so it was a different building type inside of a different building type. It was light challenge, which we'll show you in a moment. And it also had to have a sense of a place while still being permanent, so we could celebrate both. And that was the exciting part of the challenge of this. We were looking for all surfaces that the library could announce itself. This is actually the sort of the secondary entrance, also known as stroller entrance, where all the strollers would line up in Brooklyn Heights, and we just sort of painted the sign in a rather casual way on the wall. This, by the way, is the before. And it's the parish hall with its chandelier and maroon palette. But the library then needed to tuck in behind the main sanctuary of the church, and thereby creating these two entrances. So the device,
so we had to do something very simple because actually as an interim library, the budget was more limited than the other branch libraries that we're working on. So we had to come up with a really simple concept. And part of that was also there's light only on two sides. So we came up with this idea we call the bookworm, where there's just one translucent wall that basically just sort of worms through the space and bellies out to create two semi kind of private spaces, so a librarian office and then a multi-purpose room, and then the rest the sort of open library space. So this is the sort of concept model, and here you see in plan the sort of shaded area is slightly more private areas, but the other thing that was very important to us and is really important throughout all of our work is that there was an equity of light, so that all the spaces get a sense of light, and so this translucent wall provided for that. So you see here this sort of transformation of this hall with this translucent bookworm wall that's going through that space. And the concept of this, we sort of added another layer in terms of the sort of placeness. This is a text from a poem, a Walt Whitman poem, that it's
Crossing Brooklyn Ferry.
That's called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, thank you. That we basically transcribed the poem onto this translucent wall along the bookworm. So you could be in certain parts of the library and get like a portion of it, and then other areas where you could actually, if you're spending time in the library, you'd read the entire poem.
Whitman lived nearby and was fascinated by the activity of the docks, the activity of the place. So using his words to essentially become the surface of the architecture was a really important part of this project.
So you see that here in this sort of more detail, and these are some of the images of the space, and you see this sort of shared light through the windows in this translucent wall, and this sort of play with the text within the library itself. And then you can see other sort of ways in which playing with the text at the reception area, this idea of identity, as David said, because here it is in the middle of the church. So there was a lot of sense of kind of creating an identity for the library.
But also celebrating the words. If you were to just read the poem, you would have to walk 100 feet and then return. So we were kind of stretching out Whitman's stanza structure, which then kind of created more of a John Cage type of poem where you were reading lines, and you could assemble your own poem. By using Whitman, which we think, well, Cage would love that, but we kind of thought that Whitman would love that too.
And then this is, again, just the image of the other side entry, where, again, we were sort of creating a sort of signage on the outside.
So East Flatbush Library is in the neighborhood called East Flatbush.
Can you hear us okay?
It's East Flatbush is a fascinating neighborhood. It's kind of a largely Caribbean, Afro-American neighborhood. It's super vibrant, really interesting. This is another before image, and this was sort of a renovation of a 1950s library in 1985 that, for some reason, it removed all the natural light from the reading spaces. Tough space, and so what we were interested in the Urban Challenge here was how to re-engage a library, a civic space with its community through openness, essentially, and through light. So this is a rendering of the design. We're going to show some images in a moment of the panels that are actually just arrived in the city. They're not installed yet. But this idea of opening up to the city, creating a vibrant facade out of a facade that had been closed off, but also bringing light in a whole series of skylights, so north-facing skylights that will illuminate the spaces throughout the day. So this idea of the vibrancy of the pleating of the material, alongside of the graphics, which is we've painted the words East Flatbush on one side of the pleat, so you see East Flatbush here, and library from here. So it's a lenticular reading using the pleats. So viewed straight on, it might be a little bit chaotic, but from the angles, which in New York City, we approach most of our buildings on angles. We're walking down streets as opposed to axially against them. So we're kind of interested in how this, we hope it turns out. done nicely.
It's also intended to be abstract, so it doesn't look like the sort. That's the lenticular allows it to sort of on the front facade. You don't really read it that way, but it's only when you're going at sort of an angle.
So we've tested it in model, we've tested it in rendering, and we're about to see. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the panels?
So the panels are of, there are two types only, but they can be flipped. So we can get, by creating one or two pleat patterns essentially out of these 30-inch wide panels. They're 17 feet tall. We can get, a lot of, visual variation essentially.
And in terms of sort of process, so as David said, as best we can, we sort of do full-scale mock-ups that we then, in this case, we did these out of paper and cardboard and applied them.
These two are the cardboard models.
And then the one on the right is actually the mock-up from the fabricator, the contractor on site. And then here's some images. It's of the panels in the fabrication shop, and as Dave before, they've been powder coated with the graphics. So hopefully it's gotten delayed because of COVID, but this should be done this winter.
These perforated panels exist at Stella's going to go through the plan, but at the main sort of community meeting room only. So that there's a little bit of mediation, because through perforation from the outside, due to the light contrast ratios, you don't see in quite as readily. But from inside, you'll see straight through the street because of the massive amount of foot candles from the sun outside.
So then thinking a little bit of the organization on the interior, the other thing that was really important to us is this idea of shared light, which we also talked about in the other library. So we created this central, naturally lit reading room with all the program running along the perimeter with a translucent wall so that there's shared light throughout the library. So the organization is this sort of central room that also allows for, there isn't really a back of house, there are no corridors. It's really just that all rooms are kind of accessed off of this central naturally lit reading room, and the librarians sort of have natural views. And David mentioned the skylights, so we're bringing in these 3 very large skylights that are bringing natural light into that central space. It's also creating a very welcoming interior that you see from that facade. And then here are some of the images of that interior, really transforming that space from that original image that you saw that was very dark and you had no idea any access to views of the city, and bringing in this sort of natural light. And this is one of the views of that translucent wall along the perimeter, so this idea of the shared light, so that all rooms have access to light. And here's a couple of images under construction and when the skylights were just being cut in. And this is a little bit more recent. So the next library.
The next library is Red Hook Library. I don't know if you guys know in Brooklyn, the Red Hook neighborhood, but it is extremely close to the water. I think this library is 6 feet. I think this is 6 feet above sea level. So in Superstorm Sandy, it was damaged pretty heavily. It did kind of okay, but it is in a FEMA flood zone. I think it's an AE, which is the second most stringent. So the challenge.
Got a real urban challenge.
It's got a real urban challenge. It's got an urban challenge, and it's got a flood challenge. And the urban, well, here's the flood challenge. So you're seeing the library here. This is considered high ground. This is all of 14 feet above sea level here, which actually did pretty well in Sandy. There was not that much flooding. But the other fascinating part of this library is its proximity to the New York City Housing Authority housing, which is the Red Hook houses. I believe they were the second NYCHA housing projects that were done in the 1930s to house mostly the dock workers who lived in this area. It's predominantly African American now. And the challenge here is that this little library that looks like this is kind of invisible to its community. The librarians we've talked to just said that, the neighborhood, they don't even know we're here, but the buildings are 20 stories and looking down on this thing.
And like East Flatbush, you can see there are no windows, so not only do you not see in, but when you're inside the library, you don't see, you really don't see out much at all.
So
But you do have this.
And then you have this, which is also this sort of hidden garden, which is kind of dilapidated, and it's also not sort of functioning as greenery can, which in this case can and will be used to slow down storm surges. And we'll show these images.
And this
in a
garden,
moment.
as sweet as it is adjacent to the library, but there's no connection. So the image on the left, this solid wall, is to the library, but you have to go outside the library, which you see in the image on the upper right, and then go access the garden. So there's no sort of connection there.
The other factor here, and we're going to show this in an urban plan in a moment, is that the entry to the building is here, but the main intersection is here. So that's playing into our the strategy of design for the library.
So we took the plan, this is our proposed plan, and one of the main things, as David just mentioned, is we took the entry, which was located here, where the cursor is, and moved it over to the corner to really try and create a civic public building that is welcoming and transparent. And then we also wanted to look at the connection to the garden and kind of soften the corners as well, and really look at a kind of a less kind of sharp edges, if you will. So this diagram kind of shows this idea of what are these connections, the visual connections. You can be walking down the street here and be able to see all the way across into the garden. So not only does the garden feel accessible to inside the library, but as you're walking down the street, you see kind of through the layering of spaces that there's a garden. So this is just looking at, talking a little bit about process again. So this is the model. We went through a lot of different models, and we've also landed on a material of brick. There's a lot of brick in the neighborhood where it's red brick, and we're looking at a concrete brick that is in kind of a salt and pepper color and pattern. And this is also one of the model of the building. So, and here are some renderings of the transformed library, and as you can see, this is the new entry on the corner, and we've had to raise the building to address the flood mitigation, because essentially we have to create a bathtub that resists the water forces in a flood and hydrostatic pressure. But the challenge here was, because it's in this flood zone, like, how do we still make an open library? It's only one story, and we want it to be open and transparent, but we also have to essentially make it into a bathtub. So there were a lot of challenges here of partially raising the building and working with flood glass and flood walls, and then this pattern of the brick to kind of play within the material of the neighborhood, but also create this kind of lightness in the screen. And this is that image from that sidewalk that you would be looking through the library into the garden itself. So again, these are some of the images of these different facades, and obviously relocating the entry to the left.
One thing I just wanted to note, Stella was talking about the flood proofing of the building, which is mandated by code in the mayor's office in New York City now, post Superstorm Sandy. But the building currently, in the image that you just saw previously of the existing building, to the girder is 7'0" and 3/4 inches. So coming in real low, and it skyrockets up to about 9 feet, maybe 9.5. So because we had to raise the building, not too much, but had to raise it just enough to get a thick enough slab to resist the hydrostatic pressure from the water coming in from below, we have taken the opportunity to then just raise it, raise the beams even more, because once you raise 18 inches on 7'0" and 3/4, you can't get in the building. And so what we're
That's an
planning
urban
to
problem.
do, yeah, there's an urban challenge.
Yeah.
And then so once you're raising beams a little bit, we've tried to raise them, a lot more to just get when you're in a space studying and there's light, to have space over your head, to have thoughts and look up. As we all do, right? We do this when we're thinking. And, we've planned the building to do this, and we're still in the planning stages, so we're trying to hold on to these things. Stella was talking about the brick, and it's a concrete brick, as you said, in a salt and pepper pattern, so we're using sort of different shades of grays to just create a visual interest on the facade. But the other thing that we're trying to do is where, as Stella showed in the renderings and spoke about, is that where it becomes a parapet and you don't need all of the heaviness and brick, we're popping out bricks to create sort of a filigree screen. We're using 3 sizes that the concrete brick manufacturer makes, and we figured out we could organize them in a pattern where we could just pop out a brick, pop out the second size brick that is, and the longer brick then spans on what are essentially header bricks. So there we go. So we go from a solid wall with infill where it's insulated and solid to a filigree sort of screen wall up above.
And speaking of scale, again, I mean, these are mock-ups that we're working on in our shop in the office. So again, kind of working at these different scales that we all work in architecture and building models, but then also, you know, ordering the bricks and actually doing as much of a mock-up in the office and trying to understand what the light and shadow is going to do on that facade as well. And this is a view of the interior transformed. As David said, the roof is raised. It's the same structure, but just lifted from the interior of the library. So we're also now going to kind of talking about spaces of learning, looking at education spaces. We've been really fortunate to do several projects at Cornell University. So we're going to show 2 of them to you today. But I think it's really interesting. We've been talking about sort of urban challenges. A lot of the ways that we've approached, these are interior renovations to different departments within the campus. But a lot of times we'll kind of take even an interior renovation and think of it urbanistically, because you're still within a kind of context. And instead of kind of isolating the interior as just this one room, but understanding that that room is still within a kind of interior campus of the other sort of spaces around that. So the first project we're going to show is Cornell University Sibley Hall, which is actually for the School of Architecture.
So the project is as Stella said, in the historic Sibley Hall. I think it was built in 1904, this wing. And you can just see poking off to the right is the OMA project that is called Milstein Hall. Our project was this entire upper floor and was essentially, adaptive reuse, essentially, and historic preservation along with it. And the challenge was how to create these spaces, how to open up academic space to, as Stella said, to connect it as much as possible to other parts of the building, but also to retain a sense of the historic character and fabric. I mean, this is kind of an amazing space that we're in this the whole building here, where there's clearly an adaptive reuse, but like the older elements are being celebrated in a really, in a really kind of wonderful way. In the Northeast, especially in Ithaca, trying to meet energy code and attain LEED Silver, throwing a lot of insulation and sheetrock in the whole place will just get you all your points. But that's really not what we wanted to do here, especially because it was for the School of Architecture.
Yeah, and it's interesting because another challenge for this project is because it was a historic building, to meet this energy code and not lose, as David said, the sort of character of a lot of the interior. So insulating and waterproofing and thinking about where, the sort of thermal, the thermal barrier is within that sort of exterior was a real challenge.
Small anecdote on climate, when we replaced the skylights, the day they pulled it off, it's Ithaca, New York. I don't know if anybody has ever been there, but of course the temperature plummeted to 38 below zero. It was colder in Ithaca, I think, than it was on the surface of Mars that day.
One of the other things that I think this slide addresses is, as we've kind of mentioned in the libraries as well, is a really important material for us as we think of as light. I think it's one of the most important things that we feel that we work with and really sort of celebrate that, because you can make a beautiful space but without the sort of the right lighting. So, but this also starts to speak a little bit about the mix of the old and the new that we're going to talk about. But first, kind of getting at this idea of campus. This is an image of the campus, and the Sibley Hall is located right here off of the Arts Quad. But I think to what David was speaking about, our kind of initial concept, we kind of looked more expansively and thought of this as a kind of campus, which it is. Actually, Milstein Hall was already doing that, connecting Rand Hall and Sibley. And so we kind of took OMA's prompt and said, let's continue to sort of think about this, and we're doing this third floor, how do we connect beyond to the other central hall at Sibley? So this was the existing space. In this case, actually, we had much better bones to work with than some of the library projects. It's still kind of a beautiful space, but it was divided into 3 different spaces with these masonry walls dividing it, and certainly needed a lot of love. It was structurally compromised as well, because it had been, these skylights had been cut, and then it had been a library and was compromised. So what we did was removed, even though it was structurally compromised, we compromised it even more and said, we went to the structural engineers, like, can we take out these walls? Because we really wanted to figure out a way to kind of make it more open. So
It's
we,
this wall.
Right.
These 2 walls are masonry shear walls that run the 3 stories through the building. They were about 8 to 12 inches thick, so they ran all the way up. And of course, if you want to make open architectural education space, to segment them into smaller spaces doesn't really work. So in order to open it up, we proposed to remove the masonry and then replace it with a series of kind of hybrid moment brace frames.
and then
which you see here.
these frames then also kind of became these frames for the space themselves, and it became really an architectural element. And so I think this image is actually really instructive, because it goes back to how we were kind of incorporating both the new structure, and in this case it was an architecture school, so we decided to be really didactic about it. So all the kind of new structure was in gray, and the existing was in white, and it was really about this kind of trying to maintain a lot of the character of the old historic building. We replaced all the windows, and yet at the same time kind of bringing in these new elements as well, restoring the old floor. All the equipment is up in the attic space, so this is one area that was acoustically challenged, so we had much more acoustics here. And this is basically a crit space. So this is the sort of flexible crit space, gallery space. This is the hallway looking towards the faculty offices. We made that corridor extra wide, so that was also be sort of an impromptu gallery space. And again, creating natural light. All rooms get the natural light, and the offices then this sort of translucent glass at the faculty offices as well that you see here, so that even the windows on the perimeter, you get a little bit of that glow. And here you see the sort of tie rods that were inserted to also as part of this sort of structurally stabilizing the building. And then this image is really just making this connection. There were different parts of the building, there were sectional changes. This is fire-rated glass, but this idea of the campus and making a connection to that transparency, the other aspects of the building.
Next project at Cornell was Rhodes Hall. The urban challenge, this is an image of the project, kind of opening up the glass, the walls to glass, and the beautiful views to the gorge. But this is what it looked like beforehand. It was in a 1980s building. The challenge here was that the building had been planned with these just incredibly long corridors, with all of the departments segmented into small compartments. All of the offices, sort of each office, one office gets one window, and then so the sense of sharing of, number one, light, and number two, kind of a communal atmosphere, let's say, of academic sharing. What's going on in that department versus what I might be doing as a student was kind of hard to find. Not to mention the preponderance of mauve and some other weird colors. So these are sort of plans. The project for us existed on 2 levels, and it was for the 2 departments. One was called the Computer Systems Laboratory, that specialized in the creation of the computer chip. Cornell's a leader in that field. And the other was a department called Operations Research and Information Engineering.
Nicely done.
Thank you. I have no idea what they do, but they engineer information.
Are you recording this?
And don't show this to them. And that was a distance learning classroom because they needed to communicate with New York Tech, the recently opened Governor's Island campus down in New York City. And so, to address this idea, this urban idea, as Stella was saying, on a campus.
Urban interiors, yeah.
The idea of opening up the corridor. So this is one of the sort of the previously deadly corridors, we'd like to say, where we just tried to open it up to glass to create a graphic, to make an engagement. The spaces that were behind that glass were also They were acoustically treated, but they were private glass enclosed rooms. So these views through an understanding of what might be happening, people meeting, a vibrancy, as well as views through to natural light, let's say, and the views to the gorge was so important in this
Yes,
project.
I mean, in a way, this felt like this, similar to our facades on our library, right? This is just creating a layer of transparency. It happens to be on an interior corridor, but in many ways, it's not that different than the sort of facades of our single-story branch libraries off of the street. The idea is actually to create a sense of community, in this case, within the building, but we think of it, again, urbanistically, we think of this as a facade, even though it's an interior, and there's a way in which, as David said, the other departments within the building, because this was a renovation to just a partial of that floor, it becomes more communal, it becomes more participatory. You start to understand what people are doing in the other spaces. And I think we feel that that's something that's really important.
And similar to the East Flatbush Library, where graphics are applied to the facade, you're seeing a lot of graphics in our work. We love words and graphics and that sort of the vibrancy that lends to architecture. This is actually a graphic of a punch card. The program leaders wanted to actually get an old, believe it or not, an IBM Big Blue computer. We couldn't kind of figure out the space because it came in late. So we applied this punch card graphic, and we spelled Computer Systems Laboratory in punch cardese on the glass. They got it. I'm not so sure that the students, they're like, what is this
Right.
old stuff?
So the other thing that we've been finding in a lot of these academic these academic projects is just like the libraries, a sort of transformation of the program. So there were a lot of different types of spaces. There were like informal meeting spaces, the hardware labs in the middle, which we'll show you another image of. There were PhD shared offices and then other gathering spaces. And again, for us, the idea is that everyone gets access to the windows and light. There's an idea of visual transparency, but acoustic privacy, and this idea of collaboration, and not only within then the department, as you see in some of these images, but then again against the sort of corridor and the sort of larger context. So, but also this idea of like we were talking about kind of eliminating the back of house in the East Flatbush Library. Like a lot of times these hardware labs are like down in the basement with no light. So we really were excited about the fact that the hardware lab was going to be part of this project, and so we put it right in the center with glass around it. So the idea is that this kind of space is as much a part of like the meeting rooms or the offices, and as long as we could acoustically isolate it, these types of programs could actually mix, and you would see students working in the lab right against, these sort of other quieter meeting areas. So this idea of a kind of a variety of space types was really important to us, and as you can see, this sort of putting all of these rooms either at the central area or on the side so that everyone has access to the window, which is completely antithetical to, as David noted, the rest of the building floor plates are laid out. So these are some of these meeting rooms, and then we had these little areas that we called the caves that were lined in felt that were much quieter spaces. And then on the floor with the distance learning classroom, we took a somewhat similar approach in terms of there's sort of glass at the hallway, which we'll show you in a moment, but then we kind of created this wood acoustic tube that was then part of this tiered classroom. And so here you see a similar image to the other hallway where you could close off this classroom if you needed that privacy, but it was, again, participating within the corridor of the rest of the building so that there was a kind of shared activity. So now we're going to kind of jump into a project that we're talking about real scale. We have a project that talks about the scale of working at architecture, which we'll talk about, and a project that was able to jump scale on many different levels. And we call this a story of Zoid because it's actually based on one geometrical shape, which David's going to talk about, and it transforms and translates into a series of projects and is actually continuing to do that, which some of in some current projects that we're not showing, but we're going to show you, I think, 4 projects that are part of this story of Zoid, which starts with this project, which was called Not to Scale, which was an exhibition in furniture design for New York City and Miami.
So the story of Zoid began with this simply just breaking down this idea of a cube. We were invited to partake in an exhibition called Unpacking the Cube, and we just arrived at something just kind of absurdly simple, which is just to take a diagonal through that cube, slice it once, and then take a diagonal, which turned this into a right trapezoid. So this sort of affectionate term zoid came out of that, and we're kind of not done with the Zoid,
No,
are we?
we're still working on the Zoid.
Yeah, it won't go away. And so this idea of scale, we were just working with this like teeny little model that then needed to jump up to, blow up to scale to something maybe that big. So it's not a big scale shift, but it was still architecture. And then we began to investigate in a lot of other ways. But these drawings are really important to us and really important to the story of Zoid and this sort of ongoing project, because they investigate Zoid in two significant ways, one of which is infinite aggregations that can come out of Zoid, and the other is just simply scale, working from the very small to the potentially very large and infinite. The classic sort of architecture as megalomaniac idea, perhaps, that you can cover something with a concept.
And that's what was interesting to us about these drawings, is because they can be read at many different scales. The upper left could almost just look like a bench, that sort of donut shape, but it could be a floor, a footprint for a building. And then some of these other sort of patterns of the Zoid could look like, an urban pattern, and then other ones are sort of more zoomed in. So we were really interested in that, which also correlates to this image, which was a really critical kind of way of thinking for us that really kind of collapsed this way of, as we as architects are constantly working at scale models. So this sort of scale figure holding the scale model that could either be at the scale of a toy, but also could just be a model of a building. And then this sort of central image of the scale figure that the piece is actually the scale of a furniture, which is what we did for the gallery exhibition. And then the sort of middle image with the scale figure smaller, and all of a sudden it becomes a sort of small size building, and then the far right image where you see the little scale figures where it's a much larger building. So we were really fascinated by that. We're just taking this Zoid and aggregating it different ways and understanding different applications.
So the project for the gallery, we just made a very simple chaise bench, if you will, and then a larger aggregation. But we used a material called ultra high performance concrete, which at 11,000 PSI allows us to have the walls at 3/4 of an inch thick. And we were able to translate that into this furniture and other pieces of furniture. We produce these with a factory, a fabrication shop actually in the Bay Area who was specializing in UHPC at the time. And these are the pieces arriving at the gallery near our office. And then the project took on another iteration. We were asked to produce public seating for the Miami Design District. And it was kind of interesting because the original not to scale cube was 24 by 24 by 24, right? Yes. And then we needed to bump these up to seating height, and it's just going from 12 inches to 18 inches actually made it look clumsy and weird. And so because it was a public piece of furniture, we started to just think about how to kind of play with the same geometric ideas, but to start to soften the curves perhaps, think about other connection methods. So we then developed these into a series of benches that did different things. Some just went in straight lines, alternating the pieces back and forth. But then we also use these sort of a series of rules that we applied to each to then start to curve the pieces. And then also make them more ergonomic through the softening of the initial studies. This is the wiggle bench that you're seeing.
So they're just scattered throughout the Miami Design District, and so you just see these different sort of iterations. Some of them are longer, some of them are shorter, some of them have the sort of armrest that's similar to what we did at the gallery. This is a particularly long one, but they take on these different configurations. So I think, how many are there? I forget.
There were originally 6, and then we were commissioned for another 4, I think.
So they're sort of,
yeah.
They're all a little bit different. But then, right after that, we were asked to do a pavilion at Art Oh My, which is basically museum, but also mostly a sculpture park in Ghent, New York, about 2 hours north of New York City. So we were still actually finishing up the pieces for Miami, and then we decided to just keep going with Zoid because why not? And we were interested again in jumping scale. So then we started to work at the scale that was like smaller than a house. I mean, a pavilion's really interesting. It's smaller than a house, but then kind of obviously larger than the furniture pieces.
So each of the pieces have, similar to the other projects of Zoid, have the same floor plate, same footprint, but we altered the shapes of the roofs and then started to reassemble the pieces that would create very, very different rooms out of just out of the same floor plan, essentially, creating a courtyard space that allowed for a kind of a collective experience in the inside, and then, let's say, more individualized experiences in each of the rooms. These are just a series of study models. The plans, we played with different ideas, going from a pavilion potentially to a small house.
Actually,
and then
can you go back one second? Because it may be obvious, but these are all this in plan. It's the exact same shape and the exact same scale. So these are all that same right trapezoid that we were working with for the Chamber Gallery, just at this other scale. And as David said, the one variation from when it was the seating is now we've started to adjust the roofs.
So against better judgment, we decided to build the piece ourselves with our office. This is kind of a strange kind of hieroglyph locating these sort of spider piers that we jackhammered into the ground as opposed to sort of pouring a whole bunch of concrete. They're working fantastically, and we actually panelized the system and then assembled them in rings. So everything came in on panels, but then on the site we assembled them in. You can see a ring right here, assembled, that then got tilted up into place and then placed on top of the foundations. These are some of the images completed. People move around the space, go in through. There's views into this collective courtyard. You can find a moment of privacy, and you can also be collective.
So the last iteration that we're presenting tonight, because it's actually still ongoing in the office, but is
we need a new idea.
We need a new idea. Is a house that's actually near Ghent, and it's also based on the same idea. And so it's a series of rooms that aggregate and then are both outdoor spaces, which you see mostly into this covered porch, as well as indoor spaces. So this is the model for the house. So again, still playing off the same shape of the Zoid, although there are the translation, and this is actually a really interesting thing for us, the translation from going from the furniture pieces and the pavilion, which are not buildings that need to be heated and cooled and enclosed and do not include plumbing. So there's another then constraint, a challenge as to how do you translate basically a piece of art into a piece of architecture, which I think we all aspire to do on a daily basis, but that's what's so exciting about architecture, is it actually still has to have insulation and plumbing and electrical and all of these systems, and yet you still want to hold on to the pure idea. So again, it's still about the sort of the Zoid shape that's aggregated, but then we allowed ourselves some rule breakers. So this is actually a structural diagram that also was about, because it jumped at the scale of the house, and to have the opening, we needed to have beams, so we sort of flipped the beam and it became a solid wall, and then the upper floor became a parallelogram that you'll see is bisected by a stair that creates like these triangle rooms. It's very strange, but it worked out. We like it. It's just so this is sort of the site plan. This was actually originally sort of a campsite, and the house is kind of participating in these other elements within the landscape. So David earlier was saying even some of our rural projects we think of as urban, and what we mean by that is that there's like different activities that are happening within the site, and the house is just participating in that activity, but it's not the sort of the only element. So the plans are, again, you sort of see the different shapes of the Zoid on the floor plan on the lower portion, and then the parallelogram that's bisected by the stair on the upper. And these are some of the images of the house on the outside that you can sort of perceive the change in the sort of scales of the opening, and this is a zoomed in photo of that covered porch. And as you sort of see the images of the house, what was important to us in this idea of translating a piece of kind of sculpture in a way to a house is also trying to maintain the abstraction of the space. So the interiors are all clad in plywood, walls, floors, and ceilings. We did not want to make any distinction of that, and if we could have, we would have done the same material on the exterior, but that was difficult for us to sort of have a material that could translate for both. But you see the sort of, hopefully, the abstraction and the reading of that keeps running through the rest of the house. So this is sort of the kitchen and the openness of those spaces, the stair that runs inside one of those zoid spaces that then kind of bisects the upstairs. And then the upstairs is very open. So we kind of talk a lot about the sort of equity of light and views. I think for us, even thinking about domestic spaces, like a bathroom gets as much sort of glazing and light as a bedroom or a living room. So we're not kind of privileging one space over the other, that kind of all spaces are created equal, so that this bathroom is, and it also kind of reinforces an idea of campsite that we're very interested in our domestic projects. And you can see on the image on the right some of these other sort of campsite elements that were existing before that we were holding on to. So we are at the sort of 48-minute target. So I think what we'll do, we're going to show you a couple other houses really fast because we're working on a book.
But we'd like to.
But we'd like to open up and have a conversation with you. So I think we'll just go through really fast. Okay, great.
So we're working, as Stella said, the book is called 13 Ways of Looking at a House.
Right.
And it's 13 houses. We're also picking apart the elements, the domestic elements of the house program, and in 13 sort of short essays written in photos. So we're kind of pulling apart the whole idea of house.
It's coming out in the fall, Oro editions. Stay tuned. So I don't know how we're going to do this. We're just going to go really fast. Okay, so one is called Essay House in Hillsdale. Okay, next one. No, just kidding. Here it is in Platt. How are we going to do this really fast? Well, so actually, this idea of campsite, this one started as a kind of pavilion. And
you
so,
talk and I'll...
And you'll, okay, yeah. That's great. So it started as an, well, actually, go back to the Mondrian really fast.
Okay, should we slow down? Is everybody getting bored? Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll slow down a little bit. Okay. So here's the.
Can I get another beer?
So the idea that we in all of the houses we're really interested in this idea of campsite. The one we just showed you that was part of Zoid, but it's true for a lot of our houses, and actually really similar to the pavilion. This idea that they're very porous. We kind of, again, this idea of like all spaces are created equal. So like you often in both of these two houses we're going to show like all the rooms have access to the outdoors, and so we were really interested in this particular project just like a roof and columns, and this house is in and amongst this site with trees. So we were really looking at this painting by Mondrian, that this idea of kind of like semi-enclosure, this sort of these elements that are perpendicular to each other but actually don't create enclosure but create a sort of semi-enclosure, and that actually really drove the concept of the house. So we decided to take basically anything that was storage or bathrooms and think of them as these volumes that were like the Mondrian painting, that were set perpendicular to each other but in this loose pattern that never created a complete enclosure. There are pocket doors so you can enclose it, but most of the time it can be left open and you actually have privacy. You can leave like the bedroom door open, but when you're in the living room you can't see it, and it has to do with the arrangement of these boxes. So these are the sort of model shots previously, and then the plan, and then now David's going through the construction images of the boxes and the volumes themselves that create this sort of open pattern. So this is just recently completed. I don't even think it's on our website yet, maybe, or some of it is. So you see this kind of idea of this roof pavilion, and we like to do these pop-ups, which you saw in the last image, with these rooms that kind of sit above, and then we do these planted roofs. So again, this idea of being in the outdoors and all these rooms kind of having an equal idea of openness and transparency. these are just obviously some of the other interior shots. So you see these volumes that are clad in a cement board that allows it to go from inside to outside. So you'll see in some of these exterior, these part of these boxes are on the outside, and this is a cement board panel, but it continues on the inside. So there's no distinction in this case between the interior and exterior. And we talked about in that other house, we wanted it to all be the same. Here we were able to make these boxes go from outside to inside. So in this case, it has all the storage for the kitchen or closets, and then the rest is just open and floating. And here again, this other kind of volume, and then just the grills and things for heating and cooling, and then this planted roof. There are several apertures and skylights that both occur inside, so glazed skylights, and then just holes in other portions of the roof canopy that's part of the outside. There's not really a distinction. So you see in an image like this, there's a skylight on the outside porch.
So we kept playing with this idea of this very, very thin roof, which was actually only at the open spaces, like the open patio spaces. But the roof itself, of course, needed to be very, very thick for insulation, and then had plants on top. But so we were kind of playing with, where we could extend the roof out to get this view of like how thin could we make that roof look like, and by using this sort of extended patio, covered patio, we were able to achieve that from these views.
Mm-hmm. So these are some of the other exteriors. And this is the last one.
The house is really growing in with vegetation now, so
Yeah.
it's a sort of white spaceship in this like completely crazy green jungle.
Right.
It's very, very, very cool.
So the last project then is Square House, which is a project in Stone Ridge, New York. So it's in upstate New York, but it's on the other side of the Hudson River. And this project is actually most of our houses are actually quite small, which we like. And this one is 42 feet by 42 feet. 42 or 43? 40, yeah. And it is, again, this idea that you can access all the rooms from the outside, and some of those things come on the exterior as well. So here, this image shows the sort of, there's a sink kitchen that's like popping through the glass, so that the idea is that you're spending most of the time outside and you can just wash your hands and not necessarily enter the building. So it's a very simple square plan. All rooms have access to the exterior, sort of larger window apertures are for the more public, and then the sort of smaller for the private. So the plan lays out as a central kind of sunken living room, a little studio, and with a Murphy bed, a kitchen, and then a kind of large bathing area, and then another bedroom. So, and then the access to the roof. There's an exterior stair that you probably saw in that first slide that takes you up to a roof deck. So this is about process again. A lot, we work intensely in model in our office. So we're just showing you some of the models.
What we really enjoyed in this process, and to talk to students about this is, when we made the model, we were trying to think about, what's this thing actually going to look like, and how would the way we made the model start to inform what it might look like. So we kind of went on autopilot, and we thought like, hey, I always wanted to make a model that like used chipboard and stacked it up. Mm-hmm. And so when we made the model, we started looking at those horizontal striations, and then we made a casting, and we made a mold of those little models, and then we cast concrete, actually rockite, into that mold, which then started to give us this appearance of these striations. And then we started to translate that into what we wanted the building to be. So we were kind of like, it was a process of driving and discovering at the same time. And making models is invaluable for this process. You'll always drive a process, and it'll feed back to you things that you had no idea you would see.
And especially when you do something like cast in place concrete, because you have to think in reverse. And I think that process of making a series of concrete models in the office to scale allowed us to work really closely with the contractor, because as you're seeing from these images, the form work for doing a cast-in-place concrete house. It's a very small house, but I think there were 15 pours because it also steps. And so it was very complicated, and actually the formwork was really beautiful. The contractor was like furniture.
The formwork was like furniture. It could have been its own building. And we were calibrating, as you can see in this image, those striations that we'd studied in model to these steps that were to mirror the underside of the steps that actually went up to the roof.
Yeah, you can see, I'm going to
So
go
there
back
was
to
a
that
lot
first
of
image. You can really see it
translation,
here, actually.
And so behind that wall is are the steps that go up to the roof. Obviously, it's, you can calibrate, but it's kind of a process of calibrating those striations with the underside of those steps, which we and the contractor took a lot of joy and pleasure in, like, working that stuff out.
Yeah, and these are the images of the 4 facades, and this is, again, there's no formal front door or back door, which is true of almost all of our houses. And the square is this very sort of equal shape, so there's kind of not privileging one facade over the other. They all have variation based on what direction that they're facing and degrees of privacy, but in a way it's like you can kind of enter the house and all sides are sort of given an equal amount of attention, I guess you would, if you will. There are no windows, it's only doors, which is also something that we do a lot in our houses. So these are all still just pocket doors. So again, you can kind of exit the bedroom or the bathroom or the living room, but the idea is that there's this kind of porosity and an ease of movement.
We'll talk about that stair.
Oh, sure, that's the outside stair.
Stair that goes to the roof that we were talking about before. It's a really interesting space. Acoustically, you walk into this space, it's really, you're kind of like in a moment of echo, and then you kind of emerge onto the roof where they're planted
the vegetable garden.
Raised beds for vegetables. This is the bathing area that Stella was talking about. A soaking tub above ground, a hot tub in the ground, steam showers, all about these sort of watery programs, and then that whole glass wall could open up to a kind of a moss-covered landscape that was designed by a landscape architect named Mark Peter Keene, who specialized in Japanese gardens and these stone, blue stone walls, which are actually quite typical of the Catskills region. All blue stone sidewalks from New York City were extracted from the Catskills and this very region. And there was an interesting kind of conversation between the striations of the concrete walls and the striations of these laid up blue stone slabs.
And you can see the sort of stepping of the house in relation to the landscape, and then this sort of sunken living room.
The bathing area went from 8 foot and then stepped down to 8'6" to 9 foot to 10 foot to 10'6" at the farthest, the lowest area of the house.
Right.
And then finally, the snow drone shot, which is kind of a haunting sort of Andrei Tarkovsky-esque kind of image that we love.
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'd be happy to take questions.
That was 59 minutes, 44 seconds, 0.62 seconds, so I think we have 26
we have all the time in the
seconds
world,
for questions.
That's enough for a few good questions, right?
Of course.
Please.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. That was amazing. And I would love to open it up for anyone that has a question for Stella and David. Yes, I'm running to the back.
Yeah.
But then I wouldn't have a job.
There you go. That's good.
Hey, could you tell us a little bit about your relationship with color? That may sound loaded, but a lot of your images are very desaturated. Maybe that's the projector, but there's a lot of black, white, gray, a little green. Tell me about your process and how you think about that.
Stella's favorite color is clear. And I think that there's always been an interest in our practice to use architecture as a frame for everything else, especially in the Hudson Valley. The winters are just phenomenal. That's when the colors actually start to get close to one another. And in the summer, the spring, and especially the summertime, it just goes into full green roar. And then the fall becomes browns and oranges and burnt umbers. And I think we love to, and in our urban projects even, the kind of the the textures of the neighborhood, let's say, and the way the city provides the colors is what we love to use the architecture to frame. So yeah, admittedly, they're not washed out.
They're
just
not
by
washed
the
out
screen.
images.
You got it. Yeah.
But
yeah.
it's a
They
really
are
great,
themselves.
it's a really great question. And yeah, for the houses, it's very much about, as David said, framing the landscape. And then with the urban projects, the libraries, it is, again, it's very much about sort of framing the outdoors. And I think the desire for that muted palette is really to just make the space, but not to create more of a distraction. We're also so obsessed with light and the idea of kind of the less color to let the light be the color, because light changes the color of, as anyone knows, that we know, even if you just have a white wall, it's not white all day long. It changes all kinds of colors during the course of the day with the sunset. But then also thinking about just whether it's the houses or the libraries or the education spaces, or the idea that occupation and whether it's furniture or with the library books, or we kind of like to celebrate that, kind of create a slightly more mute context in some ways, and just focus on the space making, but let the color be something that's a little bit more reduced, so that you can kind of enjoy the other elements of kind of inhabitation, if you will. So it is intentional, but yeah.
But thank you for that
Yeah,
question.
that's a great
It's
question.
something that's really, we'd love to just sort of see how we can, what palette we actually use to bring the light, and into the space, and to let it transform throughout the day.
We've actually, on a couple of projects, we've tried to do more color. I think we're also not good at it, because we've like tried, and then we like slowly, as the project keeps going,
Well,
it's like,
now we're
and then
really,
now
forget it.
Yeah, it's too late. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your office culture, how big you are, how do you collaborate, how do you talk together?
Oh, yeah, sure.
It's like a very personal firm.
There's a lot of collaboration. So right now, we're currently at about 8 staff, not including ourselves, with then some other extended staff. But we really run the office like a studio. So it's very intensive in terms of collaboration, like tons of model making, and then like we sort of all get around the model, and then maybe there are several, and we're pulling apart the model, and we kind of have this idea that you, as soon as you walk in the door of the office, you leave your ego behind, and anyone who has a good idea is a good idea, and we also we create an environment that is a safe environment to be creatively vulnerable. And the idea is that it's okay to say, like, that's a bad idea, and you don't take it personally. And it's also like, it doesn't matter who comes up with the good idea. It's like, that's a great idea. So for us, it's actually it's really important in terms of the studio culture, because it is very much about kind of creating a safe place to be creative and to have lots of bad ideas in order to get to a good idea.
But I also think that the way we try to make things, like making models, if something gets on the table, we just start, like, let's just make stuff. And then you talk about that thing. And everybody, we encourage, we ask people, obviously, in certain days somebody might feel more quiet than others, but we say, what do you think about this?
Right.
And it's amazing to hear what everybody has to say.
And the models are just, we keep saying it, but it's so important, because it's also in terms of collaborating with our clients. It's just like, it's such a great way. Everyone gets around the model, sees it, and there's a way in which it's a very active sort of piece. And we're not, we definitely do renderings, we use all the tools, but I think what we enjoy about a model is we're not necessarily choreographing the way someone's looking at it. If you do a rendering, you're setting the camera view, and there are many ways in which that's a really valuable tool, but I think we really enjoy the models as a way to kind of move around and discover the problems when we're working on it in the office. Like, it looks great from here, but it's not so good from here, and so it really forces us to kind of vet that process. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or, yes? Yeah. Oh.
Make me work for it.
Hi, thank you guys
Hi.
so much. That was an incredible presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I had a question about, it seems you do a lot of kind of partial renovations, and maybe that's a function of operating in New York City where everything's kind of built out and you're trying to work within an existing context. My question is about kind of where the project ends within a building and how you kind of negotiate that when you're trying to deal with these existing conditions that may not necessarily have a positive reflection on your project or vice versa.
Yeah.
So kind of at what point do you have to draw the line? Do you have any kind of say in if the project needs to extend a little bit further to kind of really address something that you're trying to deal with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's very interesting because I'm going to sort of take a big overview of pretty much the libraries as an example, because we're kind of in this like fascinating moment where, what are we, 40, almost 50 years after what was known as the Lindsay, the Lindsay boxes, actually, those libraries that were built in like the 70s in New York City under Mayor Lindsay, all one story, most one story, 8,000 square feet, these boxes, and they were tough. It was a tough town then, and they're tough little boxes. They're light starved, and now we're so fortunate, we feel, to be able to be participating in kind of a wholesale renovation of those spaces. So the culture from the client agency, which is Brooklyn Public Library or Queens Public Library or New York Public Library, is it's a restart. The buildings, their programs, the social services that they provide for the communities are all being rethought. So in a way, they're kind of, there's nothing off limits except for budgetarily in what the renovation scope needs to be. That said, we've got existing structure to deal with. We have energy code to meet that changes every 5 seconds now, and flood proofing. So those are the points of friction that we work with. Let's say, I'd prefer to say with than against.
Yeah.
So we're talking about program. We're really working with the bones of these kind of old but not so old buildings. But even though they're not so old, it's still a wholesale kind of renovation of these buildings.
I mean, in many ways, it's much more challenging to work with an existing structure because you do as much as you can to just know as much about the building before you get into construction, but a lot of times things get uncovered and you have to also kind of be fast on your feet to be able to sort of address those. I think for us it's always really exciting when we get to sort of do ground up building because it's like, okay, we create our own problems, I guess then, and then there's no one to sort of blame. But it's a great question, and it's also, I think so much of this idea of sustainability is about reusing as much as possible of the buildings and trying to figure out ways to work within these constraints and still find a kind of new architecture, but without erasing that history. I think in all cases, even with you think about Red Hook, but we're leaving the roof and we didn't talk about the structure of it, but it's this crazy sort of T-beam concrete structure. It's almost like what you see for parking garages. Oh my God. Everyone's gonna throw up. and so there's certain elements of kind of keeping some of those things that's also really important to us. Obviously Cornell, the Sibley project, that's a historic building, so that was amazing, but very, very difficult to deal with that existing condition in order to not just sheetrock and dewdrop ceilings and then erase the sort of the character of that space, but then to still meet energy code and do that bring it up to a LEED silver was really, really tricky. But
Yeah. So to Stella's point, you're seeing the ends of these parking garage structures, the T-beams, and we have to raise the roof. but we want to retain those, and we're actually lifting these concrete beams up into the air. So these are the these are the elements that we're trying to just like, again, we keep pointing to these spaces around us, like it's stuff and it's there, and it's not good because it's old. It's just it's there, and how can we work with it if it's something that we think is worth using.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your talking about materials you're using inside and outside in your houses. Can you describe a little more about that? It almost sounded like the boxes that were projecting had spent more on the exterior.
Yeah, exactly. I think for us, it's so much about really pushing this idea of kind of blurring the inside and the outside. And so there's a real desire to have the material on the inside be the same as on the outside, so that you don't there's a less kind of threshold that makes the delineation between inside and outside. So in this house, we were able to, again, take what is essentially an exterior cladding material, which is a cement board panel, and bring it into the house so that between the exterior glass, the division between inside and outside, which is the glass wall, it continues to sort of wrap in the same material. So only the glass is the thing that's then making that distinction. That was something that was super important to us with this house, because we really did consider it as a roof with these perpendicular boxes, and we wanted it to read that way on the exterior as much as on the interior. So, and again, that first house, that Zoid one, I think if we could have, we would have had the inside be the same as the outside, so it would be more like the piece that we did for the gallery or the Miami design. Like, we were like, how could we make that bench turn into a house? And I think for us, that translation is really, really interesting and important, and sometimes you can achieve it, and then other times you have to find other ways. So in that other house where we couldn't have the outside and the inside be the same, but then we still just were like totalizing with the interior where it was all just plywood, so that you would still feel that space. We were trying to still kind of achieve what we enjoyed about the kind of more sculptural furniture pieces that we did prior to that.
Yeah. Elizabeth, that's a great question. I mean, it really went back to this diagram that Stella talked about, where once we kind of went from Mondrian to this diagram, placing boxes in the landscape, let's say, and then putting a roof on top, and then glass is just glass.
Right.
It can blow away, and then it's this idea of campsite. You're sort of camping out there.
Yeah.
That was kind of what.
That was
got
the
to that.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the back.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I think it was great. You talked about the library project, and they were super interesting. One question that I have is, for example, that Seattle library that OMA designed, that was like a big change in terms of the library that we knew. But how about the future libraries, especially that everything is going to be like digital and less like hard copy? What do you think the impact would be on architecture and designing the space?
Yes.
That's a great question, and actually we've given a different version of a lecture talking about the libraries, very much based on your question, so perfect. Actually, the libraries are already changing in many ways, and we've taught several studios on libraries. It's a real passion project for us. What's so interesting about, like, for instance, the different branch libraries that we're working on in New York is they all have a different approach to programs. So some of them actually are still holding quite a bit of their book collection, and we need to accommodate for that. Other ones are like, we don't need the book collection so much. We have other ways of circulating the books, but it's really important for us to have, 4 different types of meeting rooms because they're doing multi-purpose. I mean, libraries now are really taking on so many other social services. We have to deal with after-school programs with the kids. There are school lunches that also, the libraries are kind of taking on places where, taking on services that other agencies are not able to do anymore. There are, English as a second language instruction going on. There are not in our libraries that we've worked on currently, but within this sort of portfolio of libraries that we've seen in New York, and actually I think across the country, they're doing things like maker spaces. There's like vocational training. I mean, libraries are like nothing. They're not containers of books anymore, which is super exciting.
But they also are.
They still are, exactly.
Yeah.
And
It's very interesting.
What's so amazing about libraries, we feel, is it's just like these civic buildings, and they're doing so much. And especially the branch libraries, they're like small and mighty, and they're doing everything for the community in many ways, because a lot of the other sort of services have been eliminated. So libraries are doing a lot of the work.
The book that what
Yeah.
your question gets to is this idea of the book. And it's so interesting because when did we start? We've been working on libraries since about 2012. And at that point, it was like, you know what? The book's going away. And even talking with the agencies, it was like, we need less shelving because we all know it's going away. And over the course of only 9 years, it's like the book is back and so is everything else. So the 8,000 square foot Lindsay box that was, quote unquote, just a box with some books around the perimeter, now needs all the stuff that Stella talked about, plus all the books,
Right.
Plus all the programming. So, and it's a delicate dance, but it's also a fascinating dance. And we're so interested in this whole history of, the relationship between the city, the building, the book, our bodies, which has changed throughout history, how one takes a book or one goes to a book, and then what that will then become in our sort of hybrid digital and physical future. It's a fascinating moment in kind of like the design of this type, as well as the containment of human knowledge, not to make it maybe a little bit too broad of a point. Yes.
I wanted to ask a question, and maybe hopefully you could unpack a little bit about this idea of the campsite. I think just mentioning that word is, it's pretty visceral, and I also see it in a lot of your work in that there's a informality to the arrangement of spaces, and in particular a equity across types of spaces, which tends to be, I guess, counter to architectural education, where we study things like served versus servant and public versus private, and y'all don't seem to approach your work that way, and I just wonder what the origin is to that, and if there's a backstory, is it client-driven, et cetera?
So
That's great. Thank you for that question.
we talk a lot about this in our book, and so
Page 53 will explain all of that.
These are such great questions. Thank you. It is something that it's very intentional. In one sense, I could say it comes from Robin Evans in Translation from Building to Drawing. It's a book where he actually talks exactly, one of the examples is he talks about the corridor. And we talk a lot about the politics of space, and it's embedded in our work. We didn't talk about it so much today, but it's something that is really, really important to us as architects, our responsibility towards understanding the embedded politics of space. So even a corridor, the idea of served and how that creates a certain sense of hierarchy. And so we do try and eliminate that almost across the board. The idea of the informality, I mean, thank you for reading that, because it's so much about what's embedded in the work, and trying to, remove sort of back of house, front of house, remove some of those delineations, and try and think of spaces that are traditionally thought of as secondary spaces, and elevating them to be sort of at the same level of a more primary space. Similarly with materials, taking plywood and letting that be a finished material. So it is something that's truly important to all aspects of our work. We didn't show the project, the sort of largest project that we have in the office by far, the life sciences building, which is the 300,000 square foot building. It's up in Harlem. And it's so ironic because it's like the biggest project we've ever done, but the most important part of that project, which is that we were able to achieve a mid-block pass-through that provides for urban sort of garden pass-through to the city. And so it was very much about kind of, whenever you do a project, how can you give back to the sort of larger context? So when we talk about the sort of urban interiors, we're trying to give back to the rest of the sort of floor plate in that building by allowing light to come into the corridor, or the libraries, how do they participate in their urban context and kind of give back to the neighborhood? Or in this case with the life sciences building, it's like we're building this really big building, and like what can that provide, what can it give back? How can it be generous to its community? So it has this sort of mid-block pass-through, which we were able to work with these developers who got on board really quickly with this idea of not building full to the lot. We were still able to build the full bulk that they wanted, but to create a negative space that then has this garden pass-through between 125th and 126th Street. So yes to all of that, and to sort of to deny that kind of formality, to allow a kind of way of experiencing space in
we're also, I think it's a fascinating cultural moment that we're all living in, where hierarchies and embedded structures have created inequities, and we're all questioning it right now, where it's right on the table. It's being discussed, it's being critiqued, it's happening in our institutions. It's a fascinating moment to be working as an architect, because we create organizations that can either embed hierarchies or break them down and allow for, let's say more, we hope they can allow for, more for equity and that conversation.
Yes.
It was a great presentation. I loved your project. I realized that most of the projects that you have, they are very different, and they're not actually similar, and they're very creative, and each of them are kind of like different, instead of like following a similar path of thinking. So I was wondering if that's kind of like intentional. So you start based on the, the unique characteristic of that project that makes it so different at the end when you're designing it. I was just wondering, how is the process?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great observation. We're so interested in, when we begin a project, just to understand where we are and what it is. The great thing about being an architect and having different projects is, number one, you get to just learn something new by having a new program, or going to a new neighborhood if it's perhaps the same program, like in our library projects. It's like we just started a project in Queens for another library, but I'd never been to that neighborhood. And it's a fascinating neighborhood, and it's super different from all of the other neighborhoods that we're working in. So just the ability to understand something new, and then to think about what that means for design, right? So that we're not rubber stamping and we're not doing the same old thing. Although maybe with this damn trapezoid we are doing the same old thing, but we'll get through that. We'll get through this. That's where that all comes from. It's just this sort of this kind of pleasure in in newness, and then we get to design something new. It's fantastic.
New and a sense of place. I think again. So like as David said, like it's fascinating to us to be doing several of these libraries that, on paper and programmatically, they appear very similar. So they're like all about 8,000 square foot footprint, and even though each library, the program's slightly different, they're in certain ways also very, very similar, but their neighborhoods are completely different, or their environmental challenges, like with Red Hook, is really different. So it kind of demands that to be different, and I think for us it feels really important that each one has a sense of identity. So I think for us, there is, exactly as you said, a kind of line of thinking that is consistent, but we enjoy the way in which that thinking can translate into a variety of space types and building types and material types.
I've had to do this every night, kind of cut it off. These have been great questions. The lecture was wonderful. The library stuff is especially interesting to me. Raleigh is one of the largest cities in the country without a central library. So and we actually have a very good county-wide library system, but because we're such a suburban county, you have to drive there. The libraries have a hard time being like the centers of their communities.
Interesting.
So I think that's in our city program an especially significant missing piece.
Interesting.
For us. So. But it was a wonderful lecture. Your questions were great. I don't really have any wrapping up words. This is the last one. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for the questions, everybody.
And congratulations.
Yeah, great questions.
Thank you. Yeah, the students have to go,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, you guys have
a lot of work to do.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry
I
for
do.
going on so
One
long.
last thing I want to remind you of is there is one of the Phil Freelon series lectures is tomorrow night. It's a virtual lecture at 5 o'clock. David mentioned it earlier. I hope you guys will join it. I want to say especially to the young people in the room, it's great to see so many students here, both participants in the workshop, but students at NC State. This is how you learn. This is how you see great work. So I hope you'll join the school tomorrow for that lecture as well. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.